Okay, so like it's been a while since I've done any kind of like video stuff. Um, and there's plans. I've got things that I'm definitely like gonna do. But this video is gonna be a bit of like a tough one. Just like I don't think you need any like warnings or anything per se. Like I'm not gonna get like super deep into anything that would be like a common trigger or like whatever. Um, but kind of like the basic idea here is that I'm just I'm stopping um, work on like any kind of trans studies project. Like I've just kind of really realized that it's not something that I actually want to do. Um, and like the last few months, I mean, I don't know when I would say that this really started, but probably not like until the fall. I started to really kind of like think hard about, or I guess kind of just like come to the realization that like I was having like a really tough time figuring out the difference between like things I actually want to do, things that I have the capacity to do, whether I like actually want to do it, like whether it's actually going to be something that I would enjoy for my own purposes. And the third is like the things that I just feel that like like circumstances or various things have kind of like coerced me into doing for kind of like um, self-preservation or like survival basically. And it's just kind of like the more that I've thought back on like my priorities over like the last few years and like my time in comics, the more it's just kind of like difficult for me to identify the differentiation there. And like that in and of itself is enough to really make me like question what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, or like just want to stop it, because it's like if I can't, like that level of ambiguity is already enough to say, well, I'm not I'm not certain enough that I'm doing this for the right reasons at all. Um, and I think part of that, and again, this is kind of why I say like at least last fall, um, is that after like the latest round of all of like the spring and summer of 2020, when there were just so many just like cascading waves of disclosures of like abuse and harassment in the comic book industry. And like again, just for like clarity's sake, I think it's important in terms of like I guess sort of my positionality and like the things that I talk about, that like I have not been like directly like physically um, harmed by anybody in the industry. Like I haven't been like abused or like sexually harassed or assaulted or anything like that. So it's just clear, just to make it clear. Um, but just kind of like again like absorbing another kind of like wave after wave after wave of like all of these stories and what people went through. And like I've kind of like said before, like one of the few things that like one of really the only things I've ever really taken that was good from Andrea Dorkin was a bit of a speech where she kind of like talked about the weight of like taking on other people's traumas, and that in and of itself can be very difficult and like I don't know, maybe traumatizing, but it's very difficult. It does a number on you, and just like trying to sort through that and sift through that and kind of like understand what people were saying about like all of these circumstances, like the good stuff that people were saying, like the productive, meaningful things that people were saying about like dealing with trauma, moving through these things, and dealing with the the aftermath, I guess. Yeah, the aftermath of it. Um, and it's just kind of like I just started to see a lot of things, a lot of like repeated ideas and experiences, that kind of stuff that really just kind of like made me question, whether at a certain level, and I mean like, yeah, whether at a certain level, like I myself had been traumatized by the things that I've gone through, which again, none of them are like direct physical harm, um, or anything like as, I guess, intimate or whatever as like actual gaslighting, not like what Twitter calls gaslighting, right? Um, which is like a whole thing. But just sort of like just the brutal impacts of like the things that I've seen and been through and like responded to in the way they kind of like rearranged what I guess sort of like my position and my goals and things in the industry were. And again, I kind of started looking back on definitely like 2015 for sure, pretty much all of 2015, I guess. Um, and other things that have happened between then and 2020, and just kind of been like how much of this was like rational thinking on my part that just I could look at and say, yeah, I know why I did this, why I said this, why I chose to respond to this at all, or why I chose to respond to this in that way, and just kind of be like, how much of that can I really identify as like choices I know I made myself for specific reasons, and like what could have been like a trauma response, that just like something triggered in me. And I mean, I don't know, I guess it's always a little bit weird when you're like looking back on stuff that happened a long time ago and try to piece that together relative to like looking at your own thoughts in the moment. So it's kind of like, maybe I have incomplete memories of this kind of stuff for different reasons, but it does kind of, I look back at it and I don't know that it's like I necessarily regret the things that I did or said or pursued. Um, but it's just like I don't know that I can say that there was a lot of real kind of solid personal agency in that, right? Like I look back at like the big pivot point. I've kind of talked about this with a couple other people. Um, Sometimes parts of it on the record, parts of it off the record, but just kind of like thinking back on all of like the Airboy stuff, the Howard Chaykin stuff, all that kind of thing, and it just kind of like I really like resent the position that I was put in. Even just like being exposed to Airboy and having to make that judgment call, and it's kind of like I've gone back and forth about how exactly I feel about that kind of thing now, and what like the best response to it could have been. Um, Partially because I guess just to kind of like understand my own evolution in thinking about like art and representation and sort of like what my expectations of certain things are. Um, and it's just kind of like, whether the depictions that I find harmful I need to necessarily respond to in a particular way. Um, but I think a large part of it like still just kind of comes down to like I resent the position that I was put in, and I responded to that in a certain way, um, and it just kind of like created a different context for like who I was and what my position for the industry within the industry was, and kind of like what people expected from me and how people saw me. And I think it really began a distorted view of like who I am, because it's And I think some of this came later, but a lot of it is kind of like, I don't know, just sort of being, I guess, complimented or celebrated as being like strong or resilient or like cool under pressure and all of these things. And it's like, you like, if you read prose on the internet, and you can see the words that make the final draft, then yeah, I guess there's a certain clarity of purpose and all of these kinds of things, but that doesn't mean that like strength or resilience or clarity of purpose are like actual emotional attributes that I have or like are part of my personality. They were like what was calculated in order to achieve a certain effect, right? And to hold myself back, right? To not give the wider public, those other parts of me, um, of like, because like those, whatever the words come across as, they were written by someone who was scared and alienated and traumatized. And I don't know, maybe going that far back to like 2015, to like Airboy or whatever, like maybe more of that came through than it did later. Um, but it just kind of like created a reputation that I think it felt like a lot of people thought like how I write is who I am, and it's not. I just, and I kind of kept following those things and kept writing on those topics, whether it was directly like derogatory representations of trans women in the media, in the medium, or like related topics like that, or abuse and harassment in the industry, because it was like a little bit of a Skinner box, right? Where people would tell me that I was good at that, and it's kind of like, well, in hindsight, it's kind of like, well, what is being good at writing about a topic that shouldn't have to be written about, you know, basic interpersonal dynamics and social contracts being just like shredded. Um, so like that's kind of weird, right? Um, but I think you see that a lot, right? Like when people write about difficult topics, and it's like, wow, you're really good at writing about this difficult topic, but it's just kind of like, it's just, I don't know, it's a strange thing to reflect on, particularly because like I've read a lot more like feminist theory and like autobiography and this kind of thing about like people who are like abuse and assault survivors who have written like visceral takes on what happened to them. And there is a certain skill there that some of them can communicate through writing that makes you understand, and like more fully sympathize. I don't think empathy fully in like the dictionary sense of the term that's really possible there, but they can frame it in a different way and make it a lot more like understandable and kind of like actionable. But it's kind of like, well, what does that mean that you're good at this, right? And what does good at that mean when it's like a type of writing that shouldn't even exist? Um, so it just kind of created like this sort of like Skinner box incentive of, oh well, I'm good at this. I'm told that I'm good at this. Like I'm complimented for doing these things, um, and I'm clearly capable of doing it, but it never really entered into the equation of like, do I actually want this? Is this something that I want for myself? Um, and obviously there was never like a question of enjoyment. Like, do I enjoy this? I mean, there's always, I think it's easy to say like a certain amount of emotional catharsis, particularly because like one of the big things that like people have said to me a lot, that there was kind of um, like I guess like a moral or an ethical like clarity to my writing on these things. And it took a lot of agonizing and questions and conversations with people to kind of try to reach that point. Um, yeah, so I mean, it's just kind of like there were incentives, in terms of like how people responded to my writing and that, and I'm sure that means that it was beneficial. Like I don't think like those that complimentary stuff like wasn't cynical, right? Like I think a lot of it, was genuine. Although like again, I don't know. It does kind of fuck with me still, about being called, strong and, smart and resilient and all these things, by, there's a class of people who complimented my writing at certain times because like the perspective that I brought and the moral clarity that I brought to the topic were things that like easily aligned with their pre-existing values. So it was very easy for them to want to compliment what I could do in service to like a perspective that they already had, to like beliefs that they already had. But like, if I pivoted in ways that maybe challenged them, right? Or if I wrote from a bit more of a visceral perspective, and kind of took a harder line sort of on where I see like trans representation particularly, in comics, and sort of like what I would prefer to see and what I would prefer not to see, then then I get ghosted or I get criticized, and it's kind of like, so was my writing only like useful to you when it supported your own worldview, right? So it just, and I've been let down in a lot of different ways by a lot of different people in that regard, and that kind of also makes it difficult for me to kind of like accept a lot of compliments, because I'm kind of like, well, where is this? I just feel skeptical of it a lot of times, and it just makes it difficult, and that really kind of makes me question a lot more what it was that I was doing, like who was it serving, because it wasn't me, right? It just was not serving my well-being, my aims, and just like who I wanted to be, who I wanted to be seen as, and just kind of what I wanted to do. But it's just any time something would happen of significance in the industry and on these topics, I just, I felt compelled to act. And I don't know, like maybe I would hope that typically speaking, like what I had to say like had some kind of like a positive impact. But like at the end of the day, like after spending a bit of time on transcription and like drawing my own comics about the things that really really matter to me, the more I started to kind of like realize that I hadn't been doing anything for myself, right? I mean, like the most in terms of comics that I'd really done for myself was just maybe occasionally picking one particular comic that I just really wanted to applaud in a particular way because I enjoyed it. But it just like I wasn't creating for myself, I wasn't writing for myself. There was always like a broader kind of like goal being served in that, right? And that just like it takes too much of a toll over time if it's just like, well, what do I want to do? Like what's good for me? Because like even when I first was thinking, like when I was first thinking of doing like a YouTube kind of trans studies project, it was a question of just like, what are things that I can do right now to kind of ground me and give me some kind of like productivity in the earliest days of the pandemic, right? When things were getting locked down and when I lost my first job in that time period, it was like, okay, well, what am I going to do? And it was like, well, I could do this, right? Like I have, stacks of like textbooks and things from all of my like women's studies classes and critical theory classes and like, like like literal trans studies textbooks that I had, bought for pleasure. So I'm just like, I have all of this knowledge I know that I have the capability to like convey this information in like an entertaining way. So it's kind of like, this is the thing that I want to do. But it was like, this is the thing that I'm capable of, and feel a particular, and see like a particular like use case for, like something, like to try to get people to really think these things through and understand these dynamics, instead of just kind of like constantly causing harm, whether it's like a low grade loss of trust because you're just not putting the time into understanding kind of the lives and the dynamics of the people that you say you want to be an ally towards, or like whatever the case may be, to kind of be like, here are the resources right in front of you to like get better at this, and kind of like stop fucking up. um you know, and it just was not long after that, when I was really in the early stages of like, how can I put this together, that all of like the J.K. Rowling stuff like really, really, really blew up. And it's like, okay, I'm gonna sit down on a couch and do like a series of videos to kind of talk to like the big top line points in that like manifesto, because like I still do believe that that was like a really super scary and dangerous like thing to say, because there's all of these like just debunked ideas and things that might feel emotionally, I don't know, like attractive or whatever, or might somehow just kind of like play to subconscious like half-formed thoughts, or like unexamined kind of like prejudices about what a lot of people think about trans people. And it's not necessarily only cis people who think these things, right? You know, and like a big precursor to that was like Rowling being like, well, I don't hate trans people. I don't think that they should be forever alone or something. There was this whole thing where she said something like they should be whoever it is that they think they can find or something, or whoever will accept them. But it was a very kind of like snooty, well, you should expect to be alone forever and unloved if you're a trans person. Was kind of like the view that she was expressing there, just beneath the surface. And like, it was just the other day, like you see that pop up on Twitter, and it's just like, it could be like an actual trans person having like difficulty with these thoughts, or it could just be some like random awful imposter you just never know on the internet. You don't. And that's one of the terrifying things about the internet, is because it's just like, what am I engaging with all the time? But they're just like, oh, you know, I've felt completely alone and unlovable, and I wish someone, you know, like trans teens should be told this, and like I wish someone had told me this when I was a trans teen. And it's just such an awful, poisonous thing, because like, yes, trans people do deal with despair and loneliness a lot, and we do suffer a lot of rejection, especially from like cisgender people who just aren't equipped and choose not to be equipped to learn how to love us and to be with us and to understand us. And it's not like that's a particularly difficult thing to do, really. Like it's not, like, trust me. I mean, like, I guess we kind of have like specialized care and feeding, but like it's not that huge a deal. And it's just kind of like doing this thing where it's just kind of like, do you understand the harm that you're perpetuating by like saying that like trans teens should be told that they're going to be like alone and unlovable if they choose to move forward on this? Like, it's just like that's just like a terrible thing. And that's the problem, right, for me, is that I just constantly see stuff where it's just kind of like, how can I let this slide? How can I let this go? I don't have very much of a platform, of course, but it's still kind of like, you know, how do I let this go by unchallenged? And we're in a time when there's just so much that goes by that is just pure awful, that's just being elevated by these algorithms and stuff, and people who just can't help themselves but amplify the shitty things that they see. And like I understand, like I've talked about the incentive structures and the way that these social media platforms kind of like incentivize knee-jerk reactions that aren't necessarily going to take all the consequences into account. But it's just, so I did have to fire back a little bit, because again, it was so much of what Rowling was saying in a very coded way that's just very cruel towards us. And you see this ostensibly mirrored by another trans person, and it's just like, no, like, don't validate this. Like, I understand that it's hard for you. Sometimes it's really hard for me. But that's not what you tell trans kids who are like trying to transition to have better lives. And it's just like, there was someone who follows me who was like, yeah, like I was told this at like a gender identity clinic when I was starting to transition, like an actual like clinician or like doctor or nurse or whatever, someone in a professional capacity or psychologist or something, I don't know, like told them that and was like, warning, you'll never have a family, and you may never experience true love if you continue down this path. And it's just like, that's awful. Like, I mean, like I'm lucky enough to deal with the informed consent model, and that like I could just go to my GP, right, to just my local doctor who does like my yearly checkups and like whatever else, and just be like, hi, I want to transition, I'm in my 30s, and of course that's part of it too. And he's just like, are you sure? And I'm like, yeah, no, like I'm sure. And then off we went, but I mean, there's no guarantee that I might not have gotten a GP who might have said things like that, right? Like there just isn't. Like he advertises as being like queer and trans competent, and so far I would say, yeah, sure. But it's hard to even like take stuff like that seriously unless you've had experience with that person. You're like, sure, you think you're trans competent, I mean, but like, just power dynamics and stuff, right? But so it's just like when you see things like that, and it's just you see that stuff and you want to knock it down. It's just, this is what I mean about the difference between like doing the things that you want to do, the things you're capable of, and the things that you feel compelled to do out of like survival. And it's just kind of like, and it's just really hard to like contemplate finding a way to protect myself from that. Like, I don't know, like, what do you do? I mean, particularly when there's still just such a level of isolation due to like the pandemic and stuff. A lot of social media and stuff is like a lifeline. And so there's no clean or easy way to cut that kind of stuff out of your feed unless you're really merciless with like who are you going to follow, who are you going to, I guess, put on your timelines and stuff, and just be like, oh, well, that person quote tweeted whatever, done, gone. You're always left with these really, really difficult, bad kind of situations. Like it's always like a psychological kind of a trolley problem where it's just kind of like, do you want to be able to keep up with this person, that you like, or that you care for, but you also know is going to be like showing you passively, of course, like when we're talking about things like Facebook and Twitter, the worst things that the trans people are being like subjected to right now. It's like a bad conundrum, but it's also just kind of like, I can't take myself out of that space as a cartoonist or like doing videos or like any of the things that I do. It's important to have social media presences there, but it's also like how I keep up with people, because so many of just kind of like my friends, pretty much like, and especially like pretty much like all of my professional contacts and things like that, it's all on social media, and there's no clean ways to cut those things out and just be like, I just want to know if this person is having a good day, or like what they've drawn lately, or like who's open for submissions, or like when the next hashtag that I should have a portfolio ready for is. Like those are the things that I want. But like Twitter is like a fucking fire hose, so it's just always this conundrum, like always having to look at all of these things coming across my feeds or whatever, like all these things that I'm not consenting to be exposing to, triggering this, and I have to stop and say, like when something comes up to respond to, and it's like, do I want to do this? Or, well, I mean, it's kind of like, am I capable of this, of responding to this, like in a meaningful way? And then it's like, do I want to do this, or do I feel compelled to do it out of like just kind of the harm that this view, right, could perpetuate? And it's tough because it's just kind of like, obviously I like making videos, right? Like I like performing in like a multitude of different ways, with varying amounts of like having clothes on and not having clothes on, and like doing sex stuff and not doing sex stuff. It's just like, I don't know, like, do you call this video blogging? I don't know what it is, but like I like doing videos like this, talking through things. I like doing drag stuff, and I like making porn, right? Like I enjoy all of those things, but it's just like, I just have to sit down and just be like, I don't want to be an educator. Like I just don't. I don't want to be like trying to invest tons and tons of like my time and effort into trying to water the seeds of creating like an education program to largely teach cis people to just kind of like be better about trans stuff, and like understand these perspectives and histories and dynamics in a way that they can engage with us in our lives meaningfully, without a lot of unforced errors and like emotional labor that we just don't want to go through with you and shouldn't have to go through with you. So it's kind of like, if people can get a lot of these like weird, awkward thoughts out of their heads by like watching my videos, then like they're not going to impose that on someone else, right? And like that's dope. And I guess a lot of my mentality around it was like, a criticism that I've heard a lot of like Blackish, and just I guess kind of a lot of Kenya Barris's stuff, maybe not his most recent things, but like is that like people kind of criticize it as being very much like a black show for white people. And obviously, like, I'm going to say like that's definitely like valid. I'm not going to question how black people see themselves in that show. Like that would be stupid. But I'm just kind of like, I kind of saw that critique, and I was like, oh, well, this critique is like the value that I get out of the show, right? And it's kind of like, it can be those two things at once, right? It can be those two things at once, where people can feel like the show is too targeted at white people and not kind of just like more of an internal conversation, or like an internal reflection of culture. And it's just kind of like, because it isn't that, there's all these conversations, especially like with the father character, like when he's at work and he has all of his like dumb and sensitive white colleagues, who say dumb things, and he will like, I think they call it it's not a confederacy of dunces, but there's actually a term for it, what the writer's room calls it, because they're very cognizant of that, right? But it's just kind of, the show lets you, especially if you're like a white viewer, sit in on conversations that would be like, not like places that you should be, or like places that you should just be like sitting spectating in as a white person or a non-black person, but like it gives you the opportunity to get the answers to dumb questions without you ever actually having to ask those dumb questions, and like impose them on black people, and make them educate you, and like make them go through the emotional like labor of doing that, right? And especially in cases where like the power dynamics kind of like sort of function to coerce them into doing it for their own like self-preservation in the way that I've kind of been talking about, right? And so like a large part of it, like again, it was like what am I capable of, and what do I feel coerced into doing were the motivators. And to me, it's like, well, if I can do something in that vein from that type of perspective, then that would be good. But it wasn't really like taking into account the fact that that's also like an extreme burden of emotional labor on my part. And I mean, that's also true of like the people who make that show. They're putting a lot of energy and a lot of like, because like acting is acting, but it's also acting, right? Like you're saying things on the script, but you also have to embody those scenarios. And even though it's simulated, it's still a lot. So they have to have conversations about all these like really difficult topics that are maybe geared towards the dominant out group, right? And so that I'm sure like takes a lot out of them, even just to like act in that show, or anybody who does that type of entertainment, or like like edutainment or whatever you want to call it, right? And so like I just really was not taking myself into account and just kind of being like, well, how much of myself and my time and my upfront money would I be like sacrificing and spending towards hoping that the dominant outgroup, that cis people, will like take me seriously, and learn these things, and not impose upon the trans people in their life knowingly or unknowingly to do that for them. And it just, and that's just it. Because I mean, like the first time that I felt like I needed to hit the pause button on what I had planned out was just kind of like getting a non-academic, more like conversational, and I guess really sort of up to date perspective on it by like listening through to Gender Reveal, and being like, okay, well, I just have it like an entirely different philosophy of how I would even want to present this information now, and like what is use out in the wide world is. And that was really beneficial, but it's just kind of like I need to look at that as like what that show did for me as a person, and what supporting it means to me as a trans woman, not like what it could facilitate for me as a potential educator. Like it's just so disconnected, and like disassociated from just like myself, to be like, yes, this is making me change my perspective on like how I would get cis people to see me as like truly human, and stop kind of like their weird different types of fetishizing views of us, and just kind of like coasting on scraps and making unforced errors and stuff, right? Like it should be about like what that show does for me and the community that it creates for me and stuff like that. And like I didn't reach that point. I didn't really start to reach that point until I was able to do my first merch for the show, to draw like the little Las Vegas Welcome to Gender Hell sticker that I did. And I don't know, like it raised like just under $100 for glitz. I mean, and that's $100 that they wouldn't have otherwise, but it's just, like it's not a huge deal, but it was just more to the point that, Tuck put so much into this show, that it creates a sense of community, because it creates opportunities for trans artists to create artwork that other trans people, and obviously cis too at this point, but like will buy and wear and display. And like the artists get supported like monetarily, and also getting that sense of community participation, but also get to direct the other half of that funds towards a charity that we know is going to go back to our own community, right? And that just creates so many like bonds of affinity and stuff, and it's just kind of like it really started to shake me out of looking at things through like an informational lens, and a very like technocratic lens, and this kind of like Obama era idea on the left that like the data says that like progressive and left wing and quasi socialist policies have merit, right? Like it's that kind of like the rise of the Nate Silver. It was sort of like, well, if we have the data and we can transmit that data to people on the right, on the left, everywhere, you know, those mythical undecided voters that are less real than this cute little unicorn. But those types, right? Like the swing voters, the mythical swing voters, and all these kinds of things. That it's just like if we could just give them the information, then they'll have it and they'll make a rational, informed decision to back these policies. And I mean, like, I don't know. I was like in my mid-20s in 2008. So like I was younger, more idealistic. So I don't know. I don't know that I want to say to people, well, this was dog shit and you should have known it was dog shit. I don't know that that's true. I think a lot of people wanted to believe it and say, well, we can marry the rational and the emotional in our politics in this really compelling way. And a lot of people kind of felt like that's what propelled Obama to victory and that's what would pass his agenda. And that's kind of like when the world got to understand that Mitch McConnell exists and what he is. And like, obviously through this pandemic, it's just kind of like we understand just how badly data and truth and rationality and science can fail in the face of like grievance and malice and cruelty. And like I don't want to be like I'm trying not to like catastrophize here, but it's just kind of like this blind belief in like data, in like collecting the right data to make the case for like, you know, like humanitarian good. It's, you can't do that. There has to be other things, right? And so I guess like a large part of me had let go of that, particularly since like the Tea Party was really, and like the resurgence of just like intentional ignorance way back then really kind of emphasized that this was like you needed more. You like that kind of like pure technocratic approach to politics and policy is dog shit. But I guess just because of like I have such a facility for theory and like my thirst and hunger for like knowledge and understanding through the humanities, you know, it's kind of like, well, if these things could transform my life, you know, like reading like feminist theory and all these things clicking together, reading Foucault and it like fitting together and all these kinds of things, if all of this has really clarified stuff for me and like strengthened my beliefs and like gave me really strong like academic outcomes and just made me feel validated and strong by my like professors and kind of like the grades that I could get and kind of like the peer views of just like me, you know, how validated I felt by being able to use theory and to like bring it back into me and have it kind of like enrich me was that same kind of like I think naive Nate Silver technocratic view where it's kind of like, well, if theory delivered me then it can deliver you too, you know. And I kind of like viewed that through the lens that was like the closest to me at the time, instead of like taking the broader view and being like, I didn't have the epiphany that I was trans or like understand the tools and things to like advocate for transness by reading theory, by reading Judith Butler, by reading Michel Foucault, by reading like Donna Haraway, the Donna Haraway thing is just a joke because I'm like, when like I've read her and I'm just like, this is wild. When am I ever going to hear this again? And then like I went to like a presentation by Tina Horn on like Dirty Talk, and she like mentioned because she's also talking about like future sex technologies and just imagining like tech utopias and dystopias as they relate to sex is just like a fun exercise as part of her whole thing because like if you haven't read SFSX yet, I don't know, honey. I don't know, right? That's just who she is. So she like puts like Donna Haraway in her like bibliography. And I'm like, this is the airiest, most high-minded, like dirty talk education that I can ever possibly receive, and I'm just like yelling. But it's just kind of like, so obviously like these things like do and can intersect. But like Tina Horn doesn't start off by saying, well, I'm going to teach you theory and that's going to teach you about sex and liberation, right? No, she doesn't. She makes a fucking comic book, she makes podcasts, she does these things. And it's just kind of like, it took me starting making my own comics to kind of just be like, bitch, you didn't get to being trans and like experience the joy of it and like understand the joy of it by like reading those books. You got there by like reading The Invisibles and Promethea. They're art, right? They are kind of like instruction manuals for like blowing up the world in different ways, but they're narratives, they're stories, they're art, they're about pleasure and aesthetics before they're about anything else. And it's just kind of like, so I didn't understand that aspect of the drive, of my own drive to like make comics until like I was like neck deep in the entire thing, because that's just it. Because the irony of the whole thing of starting transcription, and I've said this in like probably every interview that I've given since I started, transcription was just like, I didn't see any media representations of like the emotional changes that like transition brought on, and it's just kind of like people always, and it's so funny because I look at it from a craft perspective and I'm like, oh my god, my colors on that were so bad and like it was so basic, blah blah, but people still do go back to like my first like 9 panel comic, that was just because like if I say to anybody in a conversation who like knows my comics, if I say like, yeah, like just the experience of like having the testosterone in my body suppressed just like changed my emotional makeup and let me let go of just like anger and let me control how I feel anger in a way that was beneficial to me. They always go back to that one comic and they're like, yeah, that was a really wild one that has Emma Frost and Jean Grey at the end with like the fucking Phoenix. And that's, I mean, like on a different topic, like that's like why you use superheroes. Like that's why superheroes appeal to me. Because if I show you Jean Grey as the Phoenix and I show you her having that just flow out of her, like, and dissipate, then people can be like, wow, like, yeah, like I get that. They're not necessarily going to understand like the visceral feeling of like, I don't experience anger like that anymore, unless they've also transitioned or if they've been on various like, I don't know, like psychiatric medication, I guess. But it's just when they know, oh, this is this thing that takes her over, that makes her lose agency and like kill so many people, and just to have the burden of that lifted off of her, anybody can understand that, right? Anybody can get that, who's read those comics or seen the film versions or whatever. Like it's a common language that makes it a lot easier to communicate that stuff. And like when I was making those comics, and it's still to the point to now, I don't do a lot of pre-planning. I don't like plan things out. I don't have a particular agenda. I mean, those first few ones were like, hey, my emotions are changing. Let me use art to show you how that's happening, because I want other trans women, other trans people to know. Because if anyone had given me that one little piece of information, it would have increased my motivation to transition so much more. But it's just like but at the same time, like I'm looking back on it and it's just kind of like 10 years ago, I know what the wait times were when you needed to have like a psych eval or whatever to like get them to sign off on it, and how few doctors were like supervising transitions in Vancouver. And like I also know how expensive my prescriptions would have been 10 years ago before we had provincial health coverage. So like you know, even if I had been, I do know now, like I've really thought it through that, like if I had been more tenacious 10 years ago, I could not have afforded it. Like I don't know what would have happened. I don't, um, because of course, like I might have made different choices in my life or attempted different things that I wouldn't have otherwise. You know, you get a rush of adrenaline, you lift up a car, who knows, right? I just don't know if that possibility was there, but it just kind of like monetarily is just like this is $150 a month that you don't have, right? Whereas like I'm paying less than 80 and like my financial situation is much better, um, roughly, right? You know, so it's kind of like even if I could have had access to what was available then, could I have overcome all of the barriers? If I had felt more like just feeling more motivated might not have been enough back then, and that's just let me forgive myself a little bit more. But it's also like my initial rush to do that comic was just kind of like I felt such a kinship in a community and an intimacy in what Emma Jane had done, and I wanted to celebrate her, and I did. And I also wanted to be like, well, what can I do to contribute something like this? And it was just like to talk about those emotions, you know. And I think maybe other people have kind of done like it's possible that people have done kind of similar things now that I'm seeing more trans cartoonists around. But I really wanted to emphasize that in my early work so that if people were on the fence, people were in the closet, if people were, because like the big thing for me is just that like I found ways to delay going for it where it's just kind of like I'm going to focus on school, right? Or like I have this job that's making me a ton of money and I know it's burning me out, but it's just like I can't be out in this job, so I'm just going to make as much money as I can, you know. And like that decision got made for me. Like, you know, I got laid off from that job and then I transitioned, but it's just like, you know, so maybe like a year or like 2 years sooner, I could have been like, Jesus Christ, if someone had told me, or like even the whole drag race thing where it's just like, I don't know, maybe I just try to push drag as far as I can before I transition and not just, you know, which is like a goofy, temporarily embarrassed millionaire viewpoint on life. It's just like you can't be making decisions because you might make it onto a reality TV show. Because like at that time, it's just you would have to relocate to the States like Brooklyn Heights did, to be able to compete on that show before you even do that. So it was just kind of like, but I just knew you couldn't be on hormones and make it onto that show. And it was like a stupid dream that I had at the time. So there are all of these like things that just made me delay doing it because I was afraid of rejection, you know, of just being medically gay kept out of what I wanted, because so much of my early research into trying to transition was stealth era resources. Because if you were on the internet in 2008, 2009, 2010, 2012, until probably around 2014, if you were searching for information and advice on like how to transition as a trans woman, you were still seeing stealth era resources. You were still seeing these like transition timelines that tell you to like, you know, like don't grow your hair out in your current job, like get a new job as like you transitioning, and like move to a new town where nobody knows you, and like all of that. So like, you know, it's, I don't know, I mean, it's like one of those things with like Gen X and why people are always going to fight like, do these designations matter, and like when do they actually begin and end? It's always going to be fuzzy. So it's kind of like, when did the stealth era end? Like and I don't know if there's like anybody like asserting anything right now, but like I would probably put it at like 2014. You know, I kind of, you know, or like there was like a weave zone, you know, between 2008 or like maybe 2006 and 2014 that was just like this really gray area where maybe access to these kinds of things were getting better, or like if you actually got to talk to a doctor, they wouldn't necessarily be pushing you into like a stealth frame, or like they may actually accept if you let slip that you're bi or asexual or like a lesbian, right? Or like you will be a lesbian if people recognize you as a woman, right? these kinds of things that like if that kind of stuff was not necessarily entering into the decision making over whether or not they would endorse you for HRT, but the broad information out there was still kind of communicating those things to you. So it's just like I'm not a product of the stealth era, but I am. It's very kind of zennial. I was born 1984, and at this point I'm like, no, I'm definitely a millennial. But I definitely know of people who were born like 78, 79, 80, 81, who are just kind of like, they can kind of see both sides of that coin and have a bit more of a like, I don't know where I am on this, but versus like the stealth era or not, I feel very caught by it, feel very, very caught by the tail end of the stealth era, and very harmed by it. So it was very much to me to kind of like, to really do what I could to help end those residual things, that if somebody sees my comics and they're like, I don't know if I'm ready to transition yet, and if they see that maybe they have like something like anger management problems or whatever, where they feel emotionally constipated or they feel so disassociative, and if they can see my comics and it gives them hope that even just HRT alone can maybe not completely change that, but at least solve part of it to ameliorate that, it might push them harder towards doing it, might encourage them to take that leap that much sooner. So if I can get someone to jump sooner than I did, because they have that information, because they have the piece of information they didn't before, not because it's like, ooh, I want to trans the world, right? And like, I don't even want to get into anything stupid like that, but it just, it's missing information that I wish that I had, that I wish was accessible and available and part of just like the ecosystem of like the trans stories that get told and disseminated in our culture. Because like, it's just like, I know what Euphoria is as a series, and I don't want it to be the seminal trans representation, but you do like, Jules is just like, she's transitioning and everything when you first meet her, like she's been on hormones for a while, like it's her status quo, and so like that's not what her transness is until the special, and then she's like, God, like I kind of like, I want to alter this, I want to stop my blockers and see what happens to me. And so for her, it's about the melancholy of like plateauing on HRT and needing a change is what comes out of that episode, because that is so much of what Euphoria is about, capturing these plateaus and these valleys of teenage life, and that's what makes it such incredible television. Why I back that series and I love it. Love is a weird, like, I mean, it's like I was saying, like when you're really good at writing certain things, but those things shouldn't necessarily exist. I mean, writing that level of intense teen experience. Anyway, it's a show that I cherish. I don't know, whatever. But yeah, but it's not about the rush of initial gender euphoria or just like the feeling that bam, that the validated that choice to be like, wow, this completely altered something for me, right? Because it shouldn't necessarily have to be that, but it's just like, I felt like Pizzette, compelled to be like, this is an experience that I want to communicate. And like I said, like it took me a while to kind of realize that like, this is what I want to do. This is the alternative. Like, this is giving people the sense of what they could have and what they could be, instead of this technocratic mission of like disseminating the theory and the information to like get people to treat us better. It's more like, no, this is a shared experience, and like this is me talking about like the ups, the downs, the ins, the outs, the joys of like being trans and loving it, through my comics. And that's just so much more powerful and fulfilling, and just even just selfishly what the fuck I want to do with my time and what I want to pursue and what I want to show the world. It's just kind of like, like I was just kind of like mimicking the way that so much of like what cis people do in media, and especially in comics, is like, I'm a cis person who's going to teach other cis people about trans people and how to like validate their humanity. And sometimes it's like a fucking zoo enclosure like Saga, you know, and sometimes it's just kind of like the perpetuation of just like dysphoria as a metaphor as the only way to communicate about transness in like Immortal Hulk. And I kind of get that like Immortal Hulk is a very like just congenitally like just the dysphoria of the soul of a comic. Like I understand that aspect of it, but it's just kind of like there's no understanding the broader context that we just don't need one more dysphoria metaphor. This is the only way to like, you know, and it's just like yet another Rick Jones, Bucky Barnes like side character. I just kind of feel like in comics for the last like 10 years we've been trapped, like I've just been trapped in the diner with Jessica Jones waiting for like the Shield office or whatever to open, right? Like that I'm just that character, that perpetual sidekick. Because like Marvel Comics is never going to come around and say yes, Emma Frost is trans woman. We just have to accept the lyricism of that, like accept, you know, the mythos over the logos, right? And it's just kind of like all of these superhero writers caught up in the logos of like acknowledging trans people, you know, existing, and that we can feel cosmically like detached from our bodies, and these are the only things that they understand about us, right? Just pursuing the same thing over and over again, and it's just kind of like I don't want that. That doesn't serve me. That serves you. You know, and so I'm just like, this is my joy, this is my love, this is my intimacy, this is my sex, this is, you know, this is my grief, this is my heartbreak, this is my heart sickness, this is all of it, right? Like this is just like a full, complete embodiment, you know, of me, of like various slivers of me through like my comic, and obviously like mediated again, because I mean it's not like my comics are me, like I was saying, that like I felt like I had this sort of image of me that like people had, that like my writing was me, that I was stoic, that I was not being hurt or harmed by this because I was not, you know, bleeding on the page, you know, that I had waited until the blood had dried, or I had gotten stitches, or whatever metaphor you want to use, before I started writing. Like I let the initial rush of emotion fade before I started writing, you know. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't something that happened before the writing, or that there wasn't a me before the writing. So no, I mean it's not like, you know, if your only exposure to me is like the comics, like you have to understand that like that's not me. I'm still drawing a cartoon version of me. Like I've never drawn myself. Well, except in like vague flashbacks, I've like never drawn myself with like my natural hair. And depending on how you look at it, I've never really drawn myself without like, you know, like makeup and like falsies and stuff. It's still a fantasy. It's still a heightened reality. Like I still draw myself as if like I would sleep in a wig and like false eyelashes and makeup, because like my eyelids are several shades darker than my skin, and so are my lips, more so than if I was going to like actually draw someone barefaced. The implication is that it's always like a heightened, like, you know, because there's an extra level sometimes that it'll draw of like glitter and glam and like drag makeup and things like this, but it's just like the baseline of how I like draw and present myself in the comic is still like a heightened fantasy version of myself. I'm not Julie Doucette, I'm not Aline Kaminsky-Crumb, but like even like Julie Doucette and like Aline Kaminsky-Crumb are like, they're drawing heightened versions of themselves in the opposite way, where they're drawing themselves, you know, scummier literally and figuratively than they are in real life to make a particular point, right? And even if they're drawing something that they really did, or something that really happened to them, it didn't happen that way. They're drawing it the way they want you to see it, right? And that's just the subjectivity experience and all these things. So there's always these layers of stuff, right? So it's like I still kind of like struggle with that sense of people kind of like taking the comics as face value of who I am, or like the entirety of who I am, and kind of like, and I'm sure this is the same way for a lot of people in different contexts, but it's just I still battle against the idea of people putting me on a pedestal, right, because of something I wrote, something I drew, or whatever. But it's just like what you saw me write or what you saw me draw was my later considered version of it that like I tailored to you to see. And so it's just kind of like, you know, I don't want to still be trapped in that cycle of people like putting me up on a pedestal because I do certain things in a certain way, and then just kind of get torn back down from it when, you know, when they see something else of me, or like whatever. It's still like it's a tough dynamic, but it's just kind of like if I have to deal with people kind of like putting me on a pedestal, or like, I guess getting too attached or too close to me based on like the emotions that I express in my own work of myself and the vulnerability that I display, in exploring and elaborating on my own sexuality on the page. I would rather have that than like this idea of people putting me on a pedestal because they think I'm stoic and untouchable, because it just kind of meant that like I think it attracted a lot more of just kind of like crass and cynical like exploitations of like my goodwill and like who I am, where it's just kind of, I think a lot of people didn't contemplate the harm of the things that I was discussing because I didn't perform the harm that they had done to me, where it's just kind of like, oh, Emma's smart and cool and collected and calm, so we don't have to think about like the toll of what this is doing to her, like, because there have always been like certain people who like understand that like the tone of the writing is a facade, and could be like, Jesus Christ, like, are you okay? Because they recognize that like you were exposed to this, you were harmed by this, just because you didn't write down that part of it, that it didn't happen. So there always have been like some people who would just be like, like, Jesus Christ, or like, are you okay, or like whatever, or just kind of like at least showed some understanding of kind of that like I was enduring things in that sense. But there are also just kind of like a lot of people who just decided that they had this cartoon version of the stoic version of me that, that they didn't have to contemplate the wrongness of the fact that I had to deal with this stuff at all, right? That none of this should have happened, because like the people who perpetuate harm against trans women specifically, and like trans people in general, because those are two different categories in terms of like the specific sequence of events of things that have happened since 2015, because more often than not, because we're like more like, I don't know, like culturally visible and active in the cisgender male sexual imagination, the trans women occupy most of this kind of stuff. That it's just like, the harm they perpetuate never gets acknowledged. Like you get people like James Robinson who's like, oh yeah, no, I didn't mean to hurt anybody, I was trying to just show myself as like an asshole, and any other day I would have like done better. And it's just kind of like a lot of people just kind of let that skate, and they're just kind of like, oh, okay, sure. But like they didn't look at what was actually drawn. And I think it's kind of funny because the guy who drew that comic like never had to be accountable for shit, because if you look at any of those pages of that comic and like the way that he drew us, it's like, no, this is not about, it just like wasn't about showing Robinson as an asshole, because like the only thing that ever really I feel like made an impact about that comic with like people in general was the use of slurs, right? Which is bad. And I mean, like, if that was the only thing that happened in that comic, it would have been like, okay, sure, yeah, we can kind of see how him throwing around slurs is just a portrayal of him being an asshole, right? And like that also would have been just pretty gross on its face, but it was more like these drawings were just really openly derogatory and like really obviously drawn to take pleasure in dehumanizing us. So that gets too meta. You can't just say, oh well, they're only drawn to look like derogatory portraits of trans women, because we want to show that we were assholes for doing derogatory portraits of trans women. And it's just like, no, 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 no. It's very clear throughout this series that like that Robinson was and Hinkle were committed to like degrading various types of women for their own gratification. And like the end result to say is, oh no, we're dirtbags, but like just to never stop and think about the ways that those categories of women were being degraded for their own enjoyment, and that they were drawn to get laughs out of, right? Because like it's a fat cisgender woman that they do the same thing to in the first issue, and it's just kind of like people forget their artistic training when they want to be like, you know why people draw certain things to elicit certain like emotional reactions and like to draw them in certain ways, right? And if you look at the actual art, like they were intentionally drawn to demean us in a way that they thought that was funny, and I'm sure it was funny to them, and I'm sure that Robinson thought it was hilarious, and that Hinkle did too, you know, but like it was traumatic, right? It was traumatic for me, and to have, you know, my latent sexuality portrayed like that, and just like my body portrayed like that was a horrific experience. So again, like I don't know, like I've questioned a lot of what my intervention looked like and kind of what the bounds of that intervention were. But it just kind of like, because that intervention happened, I got to experience the hypocrisy of the phony apology, and just kind of like the lack of accountability and the lack of like a recognition of what the actual harm was, and with no actual attempt at restitution, which is something that like we really really have to like start forcing into conversations about misconduct in comics, because like there's all these apologies that kind of go nowhere, but it's just like, what's the restitution? What are you doing to acknowledge who it was that got harmed by this, and like what's going to happen to like ameliorate this? Like what are you going to do to make things better for the damaged parties, and not just like what are you going to do to not do this again? Because there is harm that's been done, right? There is harm that like there are injured parties that need recuperation, right? And it's just kind of like, great, who cares if you don't ever do this again? You still fucking did it, and you still fucking hurt people, and you're not doing anything to meaningfully address that, right? And the other side of it was that like whether or not the bounds of the like the intervention that I kicked off were like correct, it also kind of like exposed the kind of cynical way the corporations use LBGT activist imagery to create like a sense of like emotional attachment to the brand without having any meaningful way of like looking at the lives and lived experiences of the people that those symbols represent. Because again, it's like Image was flying like a pride flag when Airboy 2 went out, and so it's kind of like, well, I think there's a lot of like open debate that I'm not going to take a stance on anymore, about whether you can do those two things separately but concurrently, right? But I think that's what it means. But I think that's also like what the question is, and the question that hasn't been asked, that it's just like, corporations feel that they can just use pride flags and other activist imagery however they want, that they're entitled to use them to signify some kind of intent without negotiating what values you should have and should show evidence of in order to be able to use them. Because like the premise began with Image Comics is entitled to fly pride flags, right? Not Image Comics consulted with the LGBT community and said, well, what would it take for us to be able to confidently fly this flag? Because obviously nobody really thought for more than 5 seconds about this until the question was posed to me of what would make this stop? Like, what's going to end this? And I said, well, either pull the comic or drop the pride flag. And again, like, I don't know. Because, like, I just said that in the heat of the moment on Twitter as a reply to the person who was, like, the brand manager for Image at the time. And then the pride flag disappeared, right? So it's just kind of like there was never any kind of, like, there wasn't a dialogue on either end. There wasn't a negotiation. It just kind of ended because it was just sort of like, what's your priority here? Are you more interested in keeping this derogatory image of us up, or are you more interested in keeping the flag up? And they kept the comic, and it's kind of like, sure. So I guess I forced them to clarify their priority on that, but it didn't advance any meaningful conversation about like what it means to use the pride flag and like who should be allowed to use it under what circumstances, and like, you know, who do you consult? Whose permission do you get? And like, where's the line that this becomes appropriate? Instead of just like Oreo has trans flag, like Oreos as like a stunt. Like, what does that mean? Like, what are you doing? Right? Like what are you actually doing? Other than just like slapping those colors on something, you know? And like, that's what happened with the Howard Chaykin comic. And it's just kind of like, again, I don't really know that I want to take a position on like the dynamics of my intervention there either, or other people's interventions, because there were multiple interventions on multiple fronts about that comic. But like the one that came down to it for me was just like, this time there was a pride flag on this comic. Like who thought it was appropriate for Howard Chaykin to put a pride flag on his comic? Right? Like what? And nobody thought about like what are the values being transmitted by the image of saying there is a pride flag on this comic. Like I think maybe there was like one of the Bitch Planet like triple features. I don't think there was a regular issue that month. But like I think maybe there would have been like a Bitch Planet triple feature, and like for that one, it's like, sure, if I see like a pride flag on a Bitch Planet comic, I know what that means, right? Like it's still a difficult comic that deals with difficult things that relate to marginalized genders and sexualities, right? But it's a comic that's done in a particular spirit, in a particular way, that it's like, yes, this is difficult, but it is affirming in its difficulty. And so, you know, if there was some kind of like a committee where like, okay, like Bitch Planet, is it chill for Bitch Planet to have a pride cover on it? You know, and especially like actually having consulted on like trans issues for Bitch Planet, and that's why I'm saying this one, because it's so easy. It's like, yes, of course, right? It doesn't matter that like I don't know what Kelly's Uniconic identifies as at all. You know, so I don't know if they have regular LGBT like team members, because I don't know how Val Delandro identifies either. I have no idea, no clue. So like, who knows? But like, if we assume they're both straight, then it's kind of like, well, they're straight people doing this, and it's just like, to me, in my opinion, the balance swings the other way because of what that comic, because that comic was so largely built on attempting to build solidarity between cis and trans women, even though like it's been caught in limbo in that particular storyline for like 5 years and counting. But like, even so, it's just, you know what the spirit is on that, and it's just kind of like when The Walking Dead gets like a Pride cover, and it's like, okay, like Cena Grace drew it, Tamara Bonvillain colored it, so like you have like gay and trans artists doing a cover for like a series by straight people about straight people things that is fairly conservative in its like outlook and presentation. So it's just kind of like, well, what are we trying to say between even just those two? Because if we assume that Bitch Planet is a comic by straight people that has a particular, affinity to the queer community and especially the trans community because of how it's constructed, and we say, well, yes, this is communicating those values in good faith, and so yes, but then what's the rationale on The Walking Dead? Is it, well, queer creators are being like focused on and paid for this, even though the comic doesn't particularly have a strong stance on anything in that realm that I'm like aware of. There's probably some like queer characters in there somewhere, but it's kind of like, is this a comic that has anything particular to say on this topic of note? To the degree that maybe Bitch Planet does? No, not that I'm aware of. So it's kind of like, so what's the message there, right? Presuming that there was thought beyond these are just colors a slap on a variant, and then you get to Howard Chaykin, and it's kind of like, well, why is this here, right? I mean, there is a trans character in the comic, this is true, but like she is a vehicle, purely a vehicle for like Howard Chaykin's sexual imagination and like some of the darkest ends of Howard Chaykin's sexual imagination. And it's kind of like, you can read Howard Chaykin comics if you want, I don't care. But it's just kind of like, particularly because there's a very eroticized, violent, trans panic sequence in that comic, and it's just kind of like, what are you telling people who don't know who Howard Chaykin is and what Black Kiss is, for example, by putting a rainbow flag on the front of his comic? And it's just kind of like, I'm sure that he knew that it was a provocation and thought it was funny, because he just has that thing that I was talking about with James Robinson and Greg Hinkle that applies to like Robert Crumb too, that's just being titillated by doing something cruel, right, by dehumanizing someone else. So I'm sure that he thought it was a lovely little provocation. But like, what does Image as a company, what is it that they're trying to say by using our activist imagery to, I guess, ostensibly give money to, like, I think it was Human Rights Campaign, but beyond just passing along a couple dollars to like an organization that is controversial at best within the LGBT community, like, artistically, socially, and culturally, what's the message being sent here by including Howard Chaykin in this? It's just like, why are people like James Robinson and Howard Chaykin constantly invited into LGBT spaces? Because James Robinson had a story in the Pulse anthology, right? Why are these people being invited into LGBT spaces and LGBT promotions when their viewpoints on us are like notably exploitative and harmful? Because again, like, Howard Chaykin can sell his little comics, and that's fine. Like, I do not want to be exposed to or involved in or hear about like the ways that the cisgender male sexual imagination portrays trans women in our absence, like in our complete absence, because I will still watch like straight trans porn sometimes, right, with like cis guys and trans girls, like, it's fine. And it's just like, I agree with the apparent criticisms that like a lot of like the studios that have their own like trans labels for like shooting stuff that's like 90% that kind of straight porn and like 10% like lesbian T for T content, which I mean, I'm sure it's probably pretty fucking controversial of me to label that T for T, but like whatever. But you know, like that they don't have like trans producers, directors, or writing staffs, um, and it's like other studios that aren't like this is our trans label that like have trans writers studios, sorry, trans writers, producers, and directors on staff. So it kind of like those are just very narrowly like cis male control, but it's just kind of like there's still like an actual trans model in this shoot who is like giving us her interpretation of it. Like there's still a trans woman there, and she's still acting within the best of her agency to do what she wants to do. And maybe she was having, you know, and it's just like it's pro porn, so it's like whatever. Like maybe she's having the time of her life. She was great, or maybe like there was parts of it she wasn't in love with, storyline wise, whatever. Like there's a range there, but it's just like, you know, like there still has the possibility of capturing my interest because there's still like actually trans women there. You know, it's not my preferred like stuff to watch. Like I want in the overall like production kind of staff and participation of everybody involved to skew as heavily towards like all trans and no cis than like the opposite. But like my point is that it's just like I'm pretty permissive in like what I'm actually willing to engage with and like get interested in. But it like when it gets to the point of just like comics and stuff that are just like or like sorry, cis dudes like doing whatever, creating their own little trans woman blow up dolls of their own to make their little comics about. Like I don't give a fuck. Like I don't care. I don't care what the dynamics of those fantasies are. Like I don't need to see them. Whatever, do your own thing. I don't want to chase you down, hunt you down, and say no, you're not allowed to do this, or you're not allowed to make these weird little derogatory things, or this is gross. Like sure, of course it's gross, and like even you know like there are definitely like some trans girls who are like attracted to that particular stuff. Like it's fiction, it's whatever, it's fine, but it's just kind of like you know so if I don't hear about it, like I'm fine, you know. If it's to the point now with me where it's just like it's about consent. It's about consent. And I think it's very, very clear that Howard Chaykin has no respect for consent. Um, because like again, you put like a rainbow flag on it, so it's already leaving a breadcrumb trail to where someone like me might see it, you know, might be exposed to it, might wonder what's in it, and be misled clearly because like I've made this joke a couple times before and don't take it too seriously, but like there's no C in LGBTQIA or quilt bag or any of those other acronyms. There's just no C in any of those. So why you would put, you know, a pride flag on a Howard Chaykin comic is beyond me. But you know, but he likes those provocations because like he tried to put a hate crime on a cover and be like, you have to see this. If you walk into a comic book store that stocks this comic, you have to see it, right? He wanted to put it right in front of your face, whether you consented to it or not. Whereas like people who are really, really conscientious about consent and stuff like this, like Matt Fraction and like Chip Zdarsky, they get all kinds of like wild porn covers and shit for like sex criminals, but like they make a point in putting them in black bags, and part of it is like they know that the only way that they can get those things in there is to do that stuff, but they also make a very, 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 very strong aesthetic point about it because those like black bags, because like I worked at a video store that had like a porn room and stuff, like, so you know that there's, and like I've bought just like books from like gay bookstores that were just like, they weren't porn. Like I would be buying like Michel Foucault, but they would put my Foucault book in like a black bag, like an opaque black bag, because they just only stocked opaque black bags because they did have like actual pornography that you would that they would legally, right, like have to put that in to stop it, like non-consensual exposure to, right? So I would have like Foucault in a porn bag, and like the layers, right? And so like Zdarsky and Fraction really, really emphasize the fact that these are black bags, that you don't know what's in them. And they put like the artist name, like Jen Bartel, porn cover, like, or Triple X, whatever, but like on that blacked out cover, they would do that, right? And they would play with the mystery of it, or like Erica Henderson was another artist that they did it. But they created a theatricality around consent, right? And we know that Matt Fraction and Chip Zdarsky were thinking about a theatricality of consent, and not just a theatricality of like the forbidden, by playing with like the black poly bag and its history and like porno mags and stuff. Because like, and I believe this is true of Zdarsky as well, but I know this for sure about Matt Fraction, is just how intensely seriously he took 50 Shades of Grey, and just like really, and like raising all of that money for charity, for like domestic violence and things like that, because he just really, really was very serious about like mainstream fiction, like portraying kink and BDSM responsibly and consensually, right? You know, and just like taking these dynamics seriously, because sex education and education around consent and kink in like the mainstream worlds, not in like the like leather and like queer and other like queer kink spaces that are like my natural habitat, but like the ordinary straight world is extremely bad about educating about kink and consent. And so he took that deadly seriously and did what he could to counter program the culture and to raise money. So it's very, very clear to me that like on the topic of like public sex writ large, broadly, and like consent around like the images that we see and are like compelled to see in the comic book industry, that with like that with sex criminals, they did want to create a theater and a mystique and attractiveness to consent, that they packaged it in such a way that they wanted to make sure that only the people consenting to see it were going to see it, and they wanted to surprise and delight you with what was in there. And like, I unfortunately do not have the Bartel or Henderson covers, tragically. I'm sure they're amazing, especially that fucking Jen Bartel cover. Who the hell knows what it is? But like, mama, it's Jen Bartel. It's Jen Bartel. I know how she draws naughty things, and I like it. Right? But it's just kind of like, that's the whole thing of like consent is sexy, and like there's limitations of that, and there's like critiques to be made of that. But like, you can have fun with it, and that's really, really what Fraction and Zdarsky were saying with all of this, because they were doing kinds of like weird and gross stuff, but they were conscientious of like who they wanted to see it, right? And what it was saying about the overall culture of like how sex is portrayed in comics, and like the images that we see when we walk through comic book stores, and the ways that like, you know, sex and kink can be used as like aggressive, cruel, dehumanizing gatekeepers to preserve a certain like cishet male hegemony over the culture, when they did that. So it's just kind of for them to create this theatricality around the polybags, create such a stark juxtaposition around the cruel, intentional exhibitionism of one Howard Chaykin, right? And it's just like, Image put both of those books out, you know, and so that was the end of it, right? The whole Howard Chaykin thing was like, well, we're not going to put the pride flag up anymore, and then it just turned into, well, you know, at Image, like, our creators are like, they're just their own free agents, like, nothing that they say is representative of us. So they were just like, fine, no more corporate speech from Image Comics. We are done with the principle of corporate speech, because just because they couldn't get their shit together on what might be an appropriate usage of like LGBT activist imagery, like that caused them to have such a shit fit that instead of being like, okay, let's consult some industry stakeholders over this and figure out like what's an appropriate use of like, pride flags or what's not, they were just like, well, like, fuck you. we're just we're just like, we're Vanity Press with clients. We're not a publisher, right? It's very Facebook. It's very Facebook, where it's just like, they're just like, we're like a platform. We're not like a publication that makes like editorial decisions. And it's the same thing with Substack. It's just like, well, we're just a platform that things go on. We're not a publisher that has, that makes any calls editorially, balls or strikes, right? Or they pretend that editorializing is, or like the editorial decision making or like corporate messaging is like curation, right? So it's just, so at Image, they just got so pissed off that they're like, no more corporate speech. Corporate speech doesn't exist. We are just an entity that prints comics for people, and that's just the end of the story. And it's not really the end of the story, but it's just kind of like where they decided they wanted to shake out on that. So it's kind of like these interventions like exposed a lot of things, right? And just kind of like really clarified what what pride flags and things meant to certain people, and what like consent and public sex mean to different people in the industry. And so like it's just, I don't know how I feel about the dynamics of the interventions that I staged anymore. That I went about things. I don't know if there's like one single right way or like a way that I would endorse and do again. But like in hindsight, like I know, but it's also kind of like a large part of like why I can make judgments about those interventions as to like whether I would do them the same way or not, or whether I still agree with all of my arguments that I made back then or not, is because of the things that those interventions revealed. So I can't, it's just like, it's like Newton being like, well, if the apple hadn't hit my head, what other way would I have discovered or like put the pieces together on gravity? Like, who the fuck knows, right? Because it's now, and you can't unring that bell. So it's kind of like, I know what the underlying hypocrisies here were, or the underlying cruelties were, because it's like 6 years later, and like other stuff has happened in the intervening time that has clarified all of this. So I don't know, and so it's kind of like it's a weird space to get into with like, do I regret it? It's just kind of like, do I wish I just hadn't done that because of just like, just all of that, all of this sequence of events of finding myself in a place doing work that like I never actually wanted to do, that I only did it out of just like either like a trauma response. And I don't know, like I don't know if I'm like traumatized. I don't know what it means to like actually like validate the line between, oh wow, that sucks, it sucks that happened to you, and like maybe it shaped things that happened to you, and then like you're traumatized, right? Because like I highly doubt that I would be like diagnosed with like PTSD. And there's like different kinds of PTSD, and there's different ways of like it's that whole thing is its own thing. I don't feel like I would come out with like a serious diagnosis like that. But I do think that it's quite possible that like I was traumatized by exposure to certain things, and just kind of like the stresses of trying to manage my response to that in a way that shaped my responses later. Because like Gamergate was happening in like 2015, and like when Airboy came out, and like there was questions in like Gamergate spaces where like, do we want to get involved in this? Because like the whole Comicsgate shit was years away from happening, and they were just like, we don't care, we don't understand any of this. Because these were the same people who were like, Neil Gaiman, do we like him or not? We don't know. We can't. They were like, it's a wash. We don't know if we like him or not. Which, like, okay, I mean, it's a ruse game to try to like just look at any particular artistic figure and just be like, are you an ideological match for my specific weird views, or are you not, in a really like binary way? Like, that's just a rubes game no matter who you are. But it's always funny to go back to that, and they're like, we can't tell if we like Neil Gaiman or not. Okay, does it matter? Right? I mean, it's just because I guess he has a presence on the internet, so can we recruit him to our weird little, like, you know, harassy cult? I don't know. But it's just so. So, I mean, there were a lot of, like, looming, like, what's the backlash going to be, and how hard is it going to be, and what is it going to look like? And it just felt like that every single time. And sometimes that turned out to just be, like, paranoia, and sometimes it turned out to be like, yeah, no, this is actually, the blowback on this is like 10 times worse than I ever imagined it could be. So it's kind of like, again, there's kind of like a sense that I have that maybe, even just like when I sat down to like just write about Airboy, that it was just like, this is a trauma response. This is, it took me time. Like, I got the issue early, like Monday for Wednesday or whatever, so I had time to like sit with it, and figure out what I wanted to say. But it's still kind of like, was all of that still just like a knee-jerk like trauma response to seeing something that fucking awful, and then just kind of like the subsequent things just being like these grooves of like fuck, 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 and how much of it was just like actually my own agency and being like, yes, I do want to talk about this. Yes, I think there's value in this conversation, and I feel like I'm in complete control of just kind of like my emotions and the dynamics of this. It's, there's enough ambiguity around it that the ambiguity on his face is alarming, and tells me that, like, no. Because if I can look back on this with pride and say, yeah, no, I fully get why I said this the way that I did, or the fact that I stepped up to say it at all, versus like, girl, did you do this because like someone hurt you and you're like fucking out of your mind, and it was the only thing you could do to try to like get some control back over it? I think there's a case to be made. I think that a lot of any kind of like reactive writing that I did in comics over the last 5 years were like either a trauma response or like chasing incentives, or like a Skinner box kind of like chasing like incentives and validation that like came from a largely good place, but did not lead me into any kind of like positive or like fulfilling or like self-sustaining pathway. And so like, again, I've kind of alluded to this before, but it's like just don't call me a critic. Like, just don't do that, because it's not who I am anymore. And I just feel so like disassociated and disconnected from like 75% of what I did in those 5 years. It's like, I don't know, like this maybe doesn't even really need to be said, but it's just like the stuff where it was just like pure joy and just love of the game. Like anything that I wrote about, like Black Canary, like Wonder Woman Earth 1, like Sunstone, and like those real kind of like gems are just like random flexes, like I'm gonna write about Mr. Miracle. But those were all motivated by just trying to reclaim a sense of self, and not like, Emma is our favorite like woke scold of the comic book industry. Like, Emma is like the conscience of the comic book industry who will just kind of like provide like a direction and moral clarity to like difficult topics that like nobody else can do. And it's just kind of like, even very much a lot of time at the time, I was just like, I don't want this to be me. I don't want this to be what I'm known for or remembered for. And it was just very like Gladiator, you know, when Jimon Hansu's character says to like Russell Crowe, he's like, you have a big name, you should kill it before it kills you. And I'm just like, that's how I felt. That's just like how I felt a lot of the times. It's just, I don't want to be associated with this kind of stuff. So it drove me like a lot harder to try to like flex and be like, no, I'm someone who like loves craft, who's going to tell you in depth about like, you know, the contextual meaning of like Lee Lowridge's like color choices in Catwoman and Black Canary. I'm going to explain to you how Annie Wu leverages the language of cinematography to force your brain to make a cartoon in your head when you read Black Canary. You know, I want to be the bitch who's going to write about Sunstone, or, you know, or just go on like a bizarre critical theory tangent about like Mr. Miracle. I mean, like, it's obvious that everything that I said about like Mr. Miracle is correct, because superheroes are built on these foundational myths. And so like any father-son relationship that I could think of, I could pull it somehow in there, right? But it's just like, everybody fucking loves Shakespeare, right? And everybody ties things after Shakespeare. So it's just like, obviously like Tom King was thinking a lot about like Hamlet, right? With like the dead dad, like the ghost of the dead dad, and like vengeance and all of like this intergenerational shit. Like, was he necessarily thinking about James Joyce? I don't know, and I don't fucking care, because I did. Right? Like that was me trying to like reassert any kind of control over like who or what I was as a presence in comics, and what my like thoughts about comics are. That I was just like, I want escape velocity from writing about the most horrific things that happen in the industry and the awful ways that certain people get portrayed in the industry. Like, I don't want to be known for like, you know, for swimming through the sewers, you know, of the comic book industry. Like, we already have Sophie Campbell, who like metaphorically lives in sewers and draws sewer dwelling turtles and like muskrats and ferrets and other like mutated animals. Like, we have her for that. You know, we have like an awesome sewer dwelling cartoonist. You don't need me for that. It was trying to reassert some control over it, right? And like, I guess I did. Who knows? Like, you never know. You never know how successful that is, because like, if people stop talking to you to your face about the bad stuff, and instead are gonna like that gross stuff, and they're gonna be like, bitch, that Black Canary review, whatever, then it's just like, okay, cool, at least to my face I get to know that, like, and I'm just gonna have to like chill or whatever on like what posterity thinks of me. So it's just kind of like, I just have to shed so many things and just really be like, is this mine? Do I want it? Do I want to do it? And it's just been like a whole series of these things, because you just kind of feel like, okay, well, what do you do if you want to do comics and like you can write about things? It's just, everybody is in like a perpetual cycle of like, you know, pitching personal essays to all of these different websites. And I kind of went along with a little bit of that. Like, obviously, like, I started out, I had like a piece in Bitch I wrote for Playboy years ago. And I've kind of done these things. Like, I finally hit the bucket list of writing for Autostraddle. But it was just like, I was writing for Autostraddle about my own comics. Like, was I talking about my bisexuality? Yes, but I was actually like doing comics crit about my own comics. I was reviewing my own comics and talking about the ways that I put down these things on the page. And I was just like, they're paying me to review my own comics, and like, the fucking owns. Like, it was just such a narcissistic flex. And like, fair enough, it's a beautiful essay. I've gotten a lot of great feedback from it, and it's just like it's a big piece that I can sit back and be like, I did that. I don't have to talk about these things anymore. I don't have to continually reinforce. This is what bisexuality means to me. This is an inclusive view of it. This is how I feel about like allowing a male erotic viewpoint of me and like what I do to entice it and manage it. Like I've already said all of that, right? And it applies to me making porn as much as it does me making comics. Like there, and that's kind of like I didn't exactly come around and say it because I wasn't really shooting my own porn yet, but it's just like that's what it was. So it was this manifesto and this analysis of my own comics work, you know, in a way that I'm glad that it touched people, but it was also just such a narcissistic flex to write about myself and my sexuality, and I guess kind of like my past trauma, for like autostraddle bitch, right? Like that fucking owns, like that owns. That's just, it's a really good feeling, right? But it's like I don't I just didn't want to be part of like the pitch rat race. Like I went through trying to get stuff through to like the Atlantic for a few months, and it was just like it was it was just kind of like I'm chasing, and it's like, oh well, we'd like to work with you, but like maybe this one, maybe that one. And you come back with it, and I'm like, oh, you know, we would need the turnaround to be then and then. It just completely like you would just have to be chasing like the things they want you to chase, and somehow magically have the access to do it on their timeline while being like an unaffiliated freelancer who doesn't get early access to stuff. And it's just like I don't want this hamster wheel, right? Like I was writing for Comicosity the way that I did and making no money off of it because it's just kind of like I get to write like what I want to write. I don't want to be a professional opinion haver. I don't want to be chasing pop culture takes on things for like, you know, for whatever pay. You know, I don't want to be like a mercenary critic. And it's like it's chill if people want to do that. If they can find, you know, useful ways to bang out pieces for these outlets and like chase that, like go for it. But I was just like, I'm not built for this. I don't want it. I'm not going to do it. So it was one of my first big rejections of being like, no, this is just something that like I'm doing because it seems like I'm supposed to do, and other people are like chasing up that ladder. And like I just slowly started like to stop submitting to things and to like refuse invitations to do things for like no money or little money that were never going to lead me down a path I actually want to go down to. Because I was just like, I'm making comics right now. Like I want to make comics. I don't want to dig up some unpublished essay for you for $5. That like that's not advancing my comics career. Like that's just putting me in a space to get solicited for more like, you know, underpaid random like pop culture journal stuff or like random website stuff. Like that's not a career I want to build. I don't want a resume of like sweatshop stuff to like to get a position in publishing. That's not where I want my life to go, so I'm not going to do that. And it just allowed me to question a lot more of these other things and finally just be like, you know, I don't want to be sitting here and explaining, you know, like I could. Like I've seen so many things like when Gottmik did that t-shirt that had like a minor controversy that got like elevated beyond when it should be because he had released this t-shirt of just like this square of like his chest with his top surgery scars that's like a reference to the Cruella de Vil lady, what the fuck, Malcolm McLaren and anyway, you know who I'm talking about, the fashion designer that that the new Cruella de Vil movie is based on. But like, you know, you put out this t-shirt and people are like, oh, blah, 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 blah. This is actually terrible and like appropriative, and it's just like opening up like cis appropriation of like trans culture. And I'm just like, I understand that there's like a misreading of the like critiques of the racial dynamics of Robert Mapplethorpe's photography that's happening here, but this is Gottmik showing his own chest in like a reference to an extremely famous t-shirt, and it's just like we don't even know that it's his. And it's just like, yeah, you do. His logo is in the corner, and you can only get this t-shirt from his website. And it's just also kind of like honey, like top surgery scars are not the sole province of trans men. Like, we just, like, in the LBGT community, call it top surgery because that's our own, like, appropriation and, like, our own internal language. Like, a lot of people get mastectomies, right? Like, people get breast reduction surgery, right? Like, cisgender women get breast reduction surgery. They get them to treat cancer. There are all kinds of reasons why people get that surgery and get those scars. And it's just like, and like, it finally happened on the last episode. Like, Michelle Visage made a joke about Gottmik and her getting the same surgery at the same time because she got her breast implants removed, and it's fucking hilarious. It was an amazing little intimate moment that she gave to share with Gottmik and be like, you're a trans guy, I'm a cisgender woman. We both have this shared physical experience of becoming more embodied in our bodies, right? Like, of just becoming more embodied through this surgery that we both got done. And it's really funny, and I've kind of, like, I can't remember if I've actually drawn this joke out before. No, it's not really a joke, but just a little thing of, like, a trans dude with top surgery scars and the trans woman who has scars in the same place from like breast implants. Because, like, I know like cis and trans women who have had boob jobs and they have scars in the same place, but they're harder to see because they're under boobs. But it's just like, you end up with the same scar getting bigger boobs as you do smaller boobs. And it's just like, you don't have to create this realm of exclusion, right? So I always see these things and I'm like, I could respond to this. I know how to respond to this, but it's just, it's just like, I don't want to spend my time being that educator and explaining these things, because there is just a whole, like, generation of people who are just, like, coming out with these kind of, I don't know if they're, like, exclusionary, but just very like hermit feeling, very kind of like separationist, I guess. These, like, very strongly separationist, like, viewpoints that are trying to say, like, this is our sole province and it cannot escape from here and we have to regulate how it gets expressed. Or just, like, the very, like, reactionary puritanical views that are proliferating. And it's just like, you can't, like, I don't want to dedicate myself to playing whack-a-mole to this stuff. I mean, I don't know. Even if it was self-sustaining and profitable, I don't want to be sitting in front of a camera going through this stuff and making that my thing. It's just, my comics are what I want to do. They're who I want to be. And it's just like, like, obviously there's guilt when you know that you have a certain skill, or, like, you have a certain thing that you could contribute, that you have the capacity to contribute, that you're not using it to do that in that certain way. But it's just like, being an educator in that way doesn't bring me joy. It doesn't bring me fulfillment. It doesn't make me feel that I'm expressing myself in the way that I want to. And again, like, I might come back around to it and be like, you know what? I actually feel like this is, like, a fully, I'm coming at this with my full agency. I'm coming at this knowing why I'm doing it. And I might come back and do it then from that perspective, and that will be different and that will be fine. But, like, now, I just don't know. I don't know if I'm doing this because I want to. And I don't think that I want to, because it drains time and attention away from what's really, like, fulfilling for me. So I have to let it go and say, like, I'm not gonna construct a whole, like, trans studies course that was, like, initially kind of built as a response to try to get cis people to treat trans people better. I mean, like, I don't know, like, Tuck Woodstock did have, like, a stray tweet a little bit ago that, like, put into my head that, like, it would be useful to have, like a free open-ended resource for like trans people to get better educated about this stuff because of so much of like airy high level theory getting thrown around by the types of people I was talking about before, to kind of like to feel empowered to know our own history and these kinds of things. And for like half a second I was like, oh yeah, no, that's why I should like dedicate some time to go back to that trans studies project. um, but I was just like, but I think that was just an excuse to avoid the question, I think. So like there's a little door where like if I felt like there was like a context or like a grant or some backing or something that would allow me to create that in a context where I would be serving that audience, while still having enough of myself to pursue my comics, I might want to do that. But as it stands, that was like a little perspective on how I might do that. That came too soon and is too small. I think it's instead of just being like using it as a band-aid to say, oh yeah, no, that's why I should really do this. It's like, no, it's a way to like maybe come back to in the future. And it's just kind of like, again, obviously I enjoy performing, I enjoy making myself up and finding whatever excuses I can to wear like the wild clothes that I do. Because like, pandemic or no pandemic or whatever, it's a lot more like safe and fun to wear all of this at home than it will ever be to do it out in public. So like there's just no, it's just a pure like visual aesthetic, presentation of myself that like who knows how much of it can ever follow me out into the real world. Um, but like, so like obviously like I'm gonna still do some kind of videos, but like I'm not gonna like attach myself to say like I'm doing this curriculum or like I'm committing to responding to certain things and doing that in a certain way. Um, but I'm just gonna make videos when like the mood strikes me to talk about the things that like I want to talk about in like a way that I want to talk about them. So like I definitely really 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 want to get to doing more of like a little diary thing like this about my journey into kink and leather, now that I feel like it's settled down enough that I can kind of talk through it better instead of just draw through it and just kind of like have that immediate sensory like kick, I guess, or like high of being like, oh my god, I had this thing and I like, what is this thing that's happening to me, and draw, oh my god, what's this thing happening to me, and just imbue it with that energy to kind of sit back and say, hey, so like I definitely like I want to shoot that. And I mean, I have a lot of questions I need to answer for myself about this, but like I do want to do like I want to do sex toy reviews, and I don't know how possible and sustainable and whatever it is to try to do something like that on YouTube, because like I pop that kind of stuff up on like my OnlyFans sometimes, just because like I know that I can definitely get away with it there, but it's just you're never going to create like a presence attraction for it if you're just kind of popping it up there, like no matter how good my like OnlyFans presence is. But I do kind of want to like migrate that to here, and like I do, and it's always that question. It's just like but if I have to mark these things 18 plus, does it drop it down to the point of like, why would I do this? Does it just become useless to continue, or does it just mean that I have to like, hustle to get known by the companies to like keep this up? Because I think that it's really fun for me, and that's like an area of education where it's like I know that I just really want to do it because it's just fun. I just love talking about it. And it's also kind of like a thing where that's like a space where it's just like I want to like be talking about these toys and like what I do with them, and how like they interact with my body as like a trans woman, because it's just like, I'm sure there's other like trans girls out there who do stuff, but it's just kind of like it's really hard to find in that space and like read about sex toys and these kinds of things that like talk about bodies in the way that like trans women talk about bodies, because it's just like I can read and enjoy a lot of resources about like sex toys and like anal sex and things like this from like cis women who can like adapt to inclusive language, but it's still kind of like dissonant and like not my favorite thing, and I would rather just kind of get to experience these things just from like within like a trans woman's voice, um, because who like sees their body in a similar way to how I see mine, because it's just like I don't really want to read or hear about someone talking about sex and sex toys saying, well, for people with prostates, it sucks the joy and the eroticism and the specificity out of it for me. And it's just like, because the people who use that kind of like broader, more like inclusive language are trying to catch a broad audience. And I think that's great and that's fantastic. And I'm glad that they're like, there's this underlying appreciation for like, you know, different kinds of bodies and engagement with like these toys and these sex acts. But it's just, I want there to be an intimacy and a specificity, because I'm sure like a lot of cis women are like, well, sure, I could read about like sex toy reviews or like blowjob instructions from like a man, like straight or gay or whatever, but they're just like, I would prefer to hear it from like another woman. And it's just like a lot of things I'm just like, I would prefer to hear them from another trans woman. And that's just kind of like obviously a preference I have for like a lot of things like sexual and non-sexual. So it's just kind of like, I don't know, I'd like to hear and see myself talk about these things and just kind of use that framing. And it's just kind of like, you know, understand that yes, these things apply to more bodies and trans women's bodies and things like this, but it's just like, I would like to just do a little resource where I can just speak from a trans woman's perspective and be like, that's what I'm doing, and that's like why I'm doing it, because I know that you have other resources that if those other framings are more compelling to you, or like my framing is like not good for you, then you can pursue those with my full blessings. But like this is like my niche, and this is my little like T for T space that I kind of want to create to discuss these things. And so like I guess that's just what it is going forward, me kind of like playing around to see with like the things that are most compelling to me, that I enjoy, that are for me and like other trans women first. And like, you know, I don't want to be exclusionary, but I just want to be able to set those as my priorities, to be like, I want to do what brings me joy, but I also want to do things that are going to like make trans women feel the most welcome first, and then like work on the rest from there, because like I do want to talk to non-binary people, and you know, and appeal to them, because I'm in community with them, and trans men too, and like that broader trans community. But I just kind of do want to be able to make my own little idiosyncratic like trans woman first stuff, and I just kind of have to like stop feeling like there's a bomb about to go off that I have to defuse, because that's what it feels like, and that's what it felt like for a long time. Is like in 24, where it's just kind of like, you know, like the terrorists could strike at like any time, and you like have to be ready, and like, you know, you have to torture this information out of the guy because you have to get the like the information in like 1 minute or the bomb will explode, like all that kind of like manufactured nonsense that was just like Bush era propaganda to create this false sense of like urgency all of the time. And it just kind of like, I've been feeling that for so long. Like discourse could, like before I started feeling like, oh, discourse could pop off at any second the way that I do on Twitter in 2021, it was like whenever anything terrible happened in terms of like representations of trans women in comics or like some abusive figure being outed, I felt like I started having to plan for the next one, right? Like after Airboy, like what's the next one? What can I do to stop the next one? You know, and that's just like a terrible, terrible way to live. I just have to let go of the urgency that it's just like I'm not a first responder, and like viewing the role of an educator through like the frame of being an internet first responder to an incident of discourse is fucking awful. It does like no justice to the actual role of like what an educator should be or could be. Um, but it's also just a debilitating way to like just like psychologically like debilitating way to live, and I just can't do that anymore. I need to like find my joy and comfort and just kind of like now that I'm so far down the road of HRT, and like I've connected with other trans women in ways that I never could before, just to know that that's my North Star, that's my guiding light, that's the love that I love before any other. And it's not even necessarily to say like one specific trans woman, but of course like obviously there are some that I have a lot more affection for than others. Like there's definitely like special people within that special group, but it's just kind of like just like T for T as like a viewpoint on the world and not just like one specific romantic relationship. But just kind of like making that like the guiding light and the starting point of what I do, because that is where I have like where I find the most love and like not acceptance, because like it's beyond that, like the most love and embodiment and intimacy, um, right, and just letting everything flow out from there instead of just having this like just reactive defensive view of the world, and just know that I can still do a lot by like nurturing that as I can to try to like stage these like constant interventions and like create this noxious pointless role of being like an internet first responder. Like that's just, I mean, there are people like it's not necessarily a nonsense role or like a terrible role for everyone, but it's not what I can do, it's not what I'm suited to do, and it's not what I'm gonna do.